So Ryan, what's on your radar?
So yesterday I talked about how the New York City mayoral campaign of Dianne Morales imploded amid a staff uprising and unionization drive with just weeks to go before Election Day. Today, let's talk about why the Morales campaign was somewhat in contention to begin with. So heading into the month of April, the contest had broken down into a three-way race. Out in front was Andrew Yang, a man who needs no introduction to this audience. Behind him were Eric Adams and Scott Stringer. So Adams is a former Republican, former police officer, and current machine Democrat. Stringer is a fairly standard 90s-era liberal Democrat who saw the political insurgency coming and got in front of it, moving left and endorsing candidates taking on the machine like Julia Salazar, Jessica Ramos, and others who've shaken up New York politics. He was nobody's idea of a revolutionary, but he was considered the best shot at electing somebody who was allied with progressives. Then in late April, an attorney named Patricia Pastor called a press conference for her client, Jean Kim, a former volunteer with Scott Stringer's 2001 campaign for public advocate. The press conference kicked off a series of events that upended the mayoral race as Kim accused Stringer, then polling third in the ranked choice contest, of assaulting her when she served as an intern on his campaign. Within days, before the allegation had been independently investigated, and before anybody had come forward to corroborate it, the Working Families Party and a slew of progressive elected officials withdrew their support from Stringer. At The Intercept, we took a close look at the claims and found that many of the ones that can be checked turned out not to be true. Kim had made some of the false claims herself, but many others had been made by Pastor, her attorney. Now, none of this means that parts of the allegation aren't true, or that there won't be more allegations to come. This is not remotely a defense of Scott Stringer, who I frankly couldn't care any less about if I tried. But something interesting is going on in this race that has profound implications for future campaigns. So who is this attorney, Patricia Pastor? Over at The Intercept, along with John Bolger and Rose Adams, we did some digging, and here's what we found. It turns out Pastor spent a better part of the last decade working as the general counsel and vice president to a network of construction companies heavily involved in the development of Hudson Yards. For those of you who haven't followed that ongoing drama, unions and developers have been locked in a titanic fight over the role of union labor in the project. Scott Stringer, as city comptroller, was a strong ally of the unions in that fight, and the unions have endorsed him for mayor. Pastor represented a company that provided non-union labor to the project, and she twice sued the local union. The union responded by alerting the New York Attorney General of rampant sexual harassment and abuse on the company's job sites. The non-union labor was provided to a firm called Related Companies. In March, Stephen Ross, the head of Related Companies, announced a major intervention in the mayoral race, a super PAC aimed at electing any of a number of candidates, including Eric Adams and Andrew Yang. It was basically an anybody but Stringer PAC. The Hudson Yards feud was intense, and Related Companies CEO Jeff Blau made no secret of his animosity towards Stringer. A Blau business associate told me that in 2018, Blau said bluntly, "Scott Stringer is an enemy." Blau's wife, Lisa Blau, led a campaign to persuade Republican and unaffiliated voters to register to vote in the Democratic primary. It's expected to have very low turnout, and more than 20,000 voters switched registrations. It could easily swing the tide. So what about that AG investigation? It ended with a $1.5 million settlement, with the company denying wrongdoing, but the probe concluded that, quote, at least 7 different supervisors harassed female workers, including repeated quid pro quo offers to at least 5 women to falsify timesheets and thereby increase female workers' pay in exchange for sex. A trade-off supervisor forcibly kissed at least 2 female workers and circulated naked photos and videos of subordinates. At least 1 supervisor regularly tried to touch female workers' buttocks and breasts while at work. At least 2 supervisors sent pictures of their penises to female workers, and 1 sent a video of himself masturbating. Complaints to supervisors only made the situation worse. The OAG, quote, concluded victims and witnesses to harassment repeatedly notified the highest level management at trade-off of the instances of harassment. Nevertheless, management repeatedly failed to take appropriate action and, in fact, repeatedly intervened to protect the harassers and fire women who complained of harassment, unquote. What the Attorney General found would have amounted to a national or global scandal if it had happened at a white-collar firm. but it happened to blue-collar women, so barely anybody heard about it. In 2016, after repeated complaints of sexual harassment and assault on the worksite, the company's integrity monitor filed a report with upper-level management detailing the severity of the crisis and a failure to respond effectively to it. It wasn't until 2018 that the AG launched the investigation. Pastor was no longer representing the company by then, but I asked her if she had gotten the memo detailing the extent of the harassment. She told me, quote, "I cannot answer any of these questions as to do so would violate the rules of professional conduct for attorneys as well as the attorney-client privilege," unquote. Less than a year after the AG's findings were made public, Pastor was in front of the New York media leading a press conference that torpedoed the mayoral campaign of the official who had gone to war with her firm. So, Emily, here we are. There's a debate tonight in New York City. To be very clear, none of this means that the allegations against Stringer are untrue. None of this even means that Stringer should be mayor. But what do you make of how quickly progressive elected officials and progressive organizations backed away from this candidate, given who he had been tangling with?
Yeah, it to me is a weird statement, or actually I think a telling statement on the way that progressive signaling is so powerful in leftist politics, that with all of the signals and all of the sort of correct all the correct telegraphing, it goes such a long way on the left. It goes a long way on the right too, but really on the left, you can be somebody who has you can have all of these priorities that are totally out of whack with what you're actually talking about and with who you actually are. And if you say the right things, you can get away with it for a hell of a long time.
And so the Working Families Party has said that the reason that it dropped its support of Stringer was the way that he responded to the allegations, which raises interesting questions. And I do think that he made mistakes in the way he responded. At the same time, what people need to remember is that he was responding initially to headlines that said he had assaulted an intern.
Right.
It has since evolved, and now it was a volunteer who he had a pre-existing relationship with. He says it was a consensual romantic relationship. She says that it was not. But the charges have changed dramatically since then. And so the initial response was probably too much. But on the other hand, how do you respond? If you're going to deny an accusation, how do you do it effectively without saying that you did it? How do you apologize for something you're claiming you didn't do? It's an interesting question, and I don't think anybody has quite threaded the needle yet.
No, it's an incredible conundrum, because on the one hand, you don't want to make any concessions if there's nothing you're actually guilty of. And you want to do that for moral reasons and for electoral reasons. You don't want to look guilty, and you also, just for moral reasons, don't want to concede guilt if there's none there. But on the other hand, you know that you have to approach these issues sensitively and with compassion, and that's also for electoral and moral reasons. And to sort of thread that needle, as you just said, is borderline impossible, especially in this incredibly charged political climate, to have to do in a public forum. Again, it's just borderline impossible. But at the same time, this is all just sucks for voters. How are they supposed to parse through this utter nonsense that's being gummed up by all of the different sort of competing interests just to get to the truth? Thankfully, they have that report that you guys did that gets to the truth and gets more information for their use. But at the same time, it's all still murky. I mean, there's no way to really get to the bottom of this before they have to go cast ballots. And so, and get to the bottom of it in a way that, they should feel comfortable on either side. That sucks. I mean, that's a really terrible position for voters to be in, and I don't know what anybody can do about it at this point.
Right, and this very much could be a coincidence, and we don't know if this was motivated by some ulterior political motives, but we do know that in the past, these allegations have been weaponized for ulterior motives. I reported on the Alex Morse situation back in August when college Democrats there, Alex Morse was running against Richie Neal, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and college Democrats alleged that he made members uncomfortable and banned him from coming to their events. But there wasn't a specific allegation, there wasn't a person making the allegation. But just the fact that allegations were in the ether basically sunk his campaign. even as we later reported that it had been coordinated ahead of time in order to undermine the campaign and benefit some of the people that were involved. And so in a high-stakes game of politics like this, when you can so easily undo somebody's campaign, you're going eventually. I don't know if it's in this case or not, but you're going eventually to have cases where people weaponize that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as you just said, whether that's happening here or not, it happens, and it has happened in our politics for at least the last couple of years in very high profile and unfortunate ways that are really, really unfortunate, particularly for women who do have serious allegations to raise, because it makes it all the less likely they're just going to get more skepticism, more unwarranted skepticism, because we have to ask these questions about whether this is being weaponized and whether this is a political operation in order to cast doubt on somebody's character. And that is incredibly unfortunate. It's also incredibly a disgusting thing to do from people who purport to care about women and purport to care about sexual harassment and workplace misconduct and women's equality in the workplace. And it's one of those things that just, it's so unnecessary, it's so unfortunate, it's so disgusting. But as a voter, what are you supposed to do? As a candidate, as somebody who's falsely accused, what are you supposed to do? And I'm not saying that's the case here, but what is anybody supposed to do in these situations? We don't have a climate where we can sort of productively work through these conversations anymore. And that, I think, is at the root of our failure to really be able to parse through this in due time. Yeah,
we're still figuring a lot of this out. It undermines a necessary and important correction that's going on. Next, looking forward to seeing what's on your radar.